Troy, a Total War Saga. It certainly gets your blood going, doesn't it? A seemingly benign trademark application in the United Kingdom has seemingly leaked the identity of the next Total War game, and set the internet alight with dancing images of an era filled with bronze, gods, chariots, duels, and bronzed gods having duels from their chariots with glistening, sweaty abs. But until it's officially announced, Troy, a Total War Saga can only really be speculated about. So let's wildly speculate together. Total War games tend to follow a certain formula, and armed with a basic awareness of Creative Assembly's design formula as well as some historic knowledge, we can actually make a pretty solid guess about what to expect for the game. As for its location, well, that's the Aegean Sea. And many people have already commented that the last thing you want to see and play is another Wrath of Sparta campaign, because well, the map wasn't exactly the most fun in the world. But I think it's safe to assume that similar to Thrones of Britannia, this will be a much more highly detailed map, possibly even more stylized like Three Kingdoms, and hopefully a little less flat. The time period itself will be 1250 BC, and a question that I've seen again and again is whether this will take the stylistic approach or the historic. Traditionally, Total War has sort of shot the middle between the two. Obviously, there is the movie Troy to draw upon. I mean, it's called Total War Troy, for goodness sake. So you know they watched it, and everyone in the Western world watched it because it was awesome. Though some aspects of the movie are obviously ahistorical, some of the basic designs for the armor actually aren't that far off, so you can't fault them too much for trying. And if these weren't in the game, at least to some aspect, you'd lose a lot of the popular appeal of the game. Though we do know historically what the actual combatants would have looked like, thanks to things like the warrior vase of Mycenae, which depicts, you'll notice these gentlemen here in large crested helmets with basic wrapped armor and crescent shields and short spears, as well as at least one other surviving piece of very heavy armor, the Dendra panoply, with its boar tusk helmet and its multi-layered bronze plates. Though I would suggest that this was probably not indicative of the average combatant, as it's very constrictive to wear and was likely something used for chariot warfare, which brings us to how people in the era actually fought their wars. Many are worried that we're going to have another really slow hoplite sloggy game, where it's just two lines pushing against each other. Well, hoplite warfare didn't actually start evolving until about 400 or 500 years after the Trojan War. What you need to envision is in fact a lot more skirmish-heavy warfare, with cowhide shields and fast movements, much more akin to the battle tactics of the later Zulu. This period was dominated by what is called heroic warfare, meaning two individuals ride in on chariots, they jump off the backs, they clash for a couple minutes, and then they jump on their chariots again and then ride away from each other. And this just repeats over and over again ad nauseum. Without heavy armor and organized formations, it was a lot of people rushing forward, throwing weapons, skirmishing, and then backing away again. There just wasn't the manpower and organization to field huge giant armies in ridiculous formations. And if the description I just gave you of two heroes rushing together, jumping off, and dueling sounds familiar, it's because it was one of the main tenets of the most recent Three Kingdoms Total War game, which makes Troy, a Total War Saga, actually a pretty solid choice as a follow-up, especially if they're building off the existing 3K engine. It already supports duels and heroic combat, and I argue that it's actually a really good fit for this style of heightened fantasy mechanics. Now, I don't expect there to be monsters in this game. That would be a bit much for CA to push, though I do expect there will be ready references to the gods of the era. If you played the more recent games like Warhammer or Three Kingdoms, you've seen a push towards using in-combat abilities that can seem superhuman, and especially in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the accompanying literature that comes with this era, there are constant references to the Greek pantheon intervening on behalf of the heroes fighting. In fact, many of the people fighting in the battles are their direct children, so I suspect we'll see something like a god alignment system in this game, where possibly you work towards gaining the favor of Ares or gaining the favor of Zeus and then using their abilities to level up in battle or something. I don't know, it just feels like it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't see those various gods show up in a much more significant capacity. Because a totally historic ancient Trojan War would be very dusty, very small, and very short. And many of the gods already align with existing research paths in the Total War games. I mean, obviously Poseidon would be good for boats, Artemis is for archers, Zeus is for command, and I mean the list goes on and on and on. This is pretty straightforward stuff. But it does tease the possibility of the return of naval combat. A lot of people got very, very hurt by the fact that naval warfare was not included in Three Kingdoms. I personally don't like the naval combat in the Total War games. About the only time I felt it worked was in Empire Napoleon, and it never quite translated well to the ancient era. So having taken hopefully a full year to redesign it, I hope that we're going to get something a little more fun to crash together with the boats here, because as people pointed out, whereas you can argue in Three Kingdoms that it didn't need it because it's just a tiny coast, the Greek islands are nothing but islands. You have a lot of water to cover, and so you're going to have a lot of naval battles. So I don't think that Creative Assembly can rely on auto-resolve for this game, to say the least. Another system that will likely be kept from Three Kingdoms is the class system for the various heroes. In that one, obviously, you have the 5 different colors. I personally hope they cut it back down to maybe something like 3, because as is, it's actually rather difficult to build the army you like, and they've gotten a lot of critique about that. But if they don't, I suspect we'll see something like warrior, archer, chariot, advisor, commander, something along that lines. Each one of these, yet again, aligning to a certain god, would make a lot of sense to me. And as for who you're going to be able to play as, well, thankfully a quick Wikipedia search of the major players of the era reveals who your starting warlords will likely be. Total War typically picks around 10 different lords to start as in their historic games, and I don't expect this one to be much different. And I do expect that the major heroes of the ancient world will likely be tradable and recruitable, much like they are in Three Kingdoms. On the Greek side, you have Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, and the leader of the entire Greek coalition, who sort of pushes everybody to attack Troy. Achilles, king of Pythia, leader of the Myrmidons, and probably the most famous warrior of the ancient world. And he will likely start with Patroclus as his subordinate, who is either his cousin or lover, depending on who you ask. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, Greek commander and the wiliest SOB in the entire story. Clever, to say the least, and one of the reasons I think we'll see something like an advisor class. Ajax, king of Salamis, another one of the great heroes of the era who eventually kills a whole bunch of sheep, which is not his proudest moment. Menelaus, king of Sparta, brother of Agamemnon, husband of Helen, and the entire reason the Trojan War existed, because somebody can't keep somebody else out of his bed. Nestor, king of Pylos, the foremost advisor to Agamemnon. A bit older, a bit different playstyle, probably focusing around research and advisement yet again. And I argue that because of the map space, we're probably going to need something not attached to the Greek mainland, so I would go with Idomeneus of Crete, who's the grandson of the famous Minos of Crete, who fought in the very forefront of the battles with Menelaus. Now, I say this because it's a very large map. You don't want to have all your people stuck in the same place, so it'll either be Crete or possibly Rhodes, both of which had pretty famous people fighting in the Trojan War. Now, on the Trojan side, whereas the Greek side was a bunch of individual kingdoms that sort of banded together to attack the big boy on the block, Troy is the big boy on the block. It's sort of like the Western Roman Empire. It's very big, very sprawling. I do think it will be playable. It would be very odd to just have a game where you're trying to invade Troy the whole time. I mean, possibly you can unlock them after you defeat them. That'd be kind of fun. But it does seem like a missed opportunity not to really invest in them as a playable class. I personally believe you'll have the option to play as Priam, king of Troy, and he starts with his 2 sons as subordinates. I don't think they'll be separated out just because they're both physically located right there, and they both directly work for Troy. One would be Hector, the breaker of horses, the greatest warrior in all of Troy, and will probably have a chariot focus because that's his thing. And of course, Paris, the guy who stole Helen and started off the whole Trojan War, and he likely will have an archery focus, which, historically is based on his, shooting of a bow to kill Achilles through his little Achilles heel, which we still call that in English today. And that's all the ones that I can reasonably say for sure will be on the game. I suspect there are at least 2 or 3 more that are likely. The next is Asteropaeus, the king of Paeonia, which is actually just north of ancient Greece. It creates a very different starting location that allows you to put direct pressure back on the Greek states and could be a lot of fun for campaigns. He's also very well known for having been ambidextrous, and he ran into battle with 2 spears at once and would throw both of them at the same time. And he actually has the distinction of being the only Trojan to ever draw blood from Achilles in a duel, which is pretty cool. So even if his faction doesn't make it in, we know that he will. Sarpedon, the king of Lycia, is another likely option, yet again starting in an interesting position a bit further away from centralized Troy there. He fought against Patroclus in the great fights in the middle of the Trojan War and died. There's that scene where Patroclus eventually goes on to get killed because he was wearing Achilles' armor and people mistook him for Achilles. Sarpedon was actually sworn to fight alongside Troy and was one of the sons of Zeus. And so when he died, Zeus actually sent down a rain of blood to show his anguish at his death. So yet another major character with a, interesting starting location off to the side. It's also possible we'll get some Thracians, just because we want slightly different styles of combat in a game like this. You don't want everybody to be super samey if you can avoid it. So that would be Rhesus of Thrace. But there's also some other options very close nearby, with the Dardanians under Aeneas, the Ciconians under Euphemus. Any of these little minor kingdoms that went to aid Troy are quite likely. And that's actually one of the neat faction mechanics that I think you'll see play on the Trojan side, is that over the course of the war, random armies from across the ancient world came to Troy's aid. And I suspect you'll get, hopefully, a type of mechanic where you can maybe either pay them or do like little mini quest lines, things like that, and these people will then show up. The most famous of which are Penthesilea, the Amazonian queen and daughter of Ares. And I don't mean Amazons in like the mythical sense. I mean, there was actually an Amazonian queen, according to this story, who showed up, and she appears in multiple sources of literature. Now, this is theoretically a pseudo-historic document, and there's a well-trod oral tradition that she is there. Now, I don't think she would get her own army and own campaign start position. It would be cool, because that would be very different, obviously, from the rest of the game. It's very rare you see named women fighting on the battlefields, especially in a one-on-one duel with Achilles, which is what the daughter of Ares did, because, she's a badass. The other one that's pretty cool is Memnon of Ethiopia, which is an Ethiopian army actually showed up to fight on the side of Troy. You can see why I think this is a cool mechanic, where you have these distant armies coming in to fight on behalf of Troy here. And that's likely your options as who you'll play as. Now, I realize that's not much to talk about right now, but it's a pretty good thing to start with. Individual faction mechanics obviously will vary depending on their strengths, some favoring command, some favoring warriorship, things like that. But I suspect we'll see a lot of the systems from Three Kingdoms being kept in, especially the individual class traits for the heroes. And that's what I really expect for Troy: A Total War Saga. I know, at least personally, I'm actually slightly more excited for this than I was Three Kingdoms. Now, don't tell anyone that. It's a bit of a hush-hush thing. But for me, I had no knowledge of Three Kingdoms going into it. I had to research everything from scratch. Whereas Troy, I don't ever remember a time not hearing about the battles of Achilles, and I personally can't wait to play as Hector and right what I consider one of the great wrongs of history. Achilles was a bit of a jerk, if you're unaware, but as we get closer to release, I'm sure I'll be releasing videos on these guys as they come up. So I'm excited about it. I was talking with fellow YouTuber Papa Havoc, and he basically said that the Trojan War is for Europeans what Three Kingdoms is for China. It's almost a semi-mythological era where people are doing these larger-than-life actions and are supported by the wills of the heavens. And it's really sort of ingrained in the culture itself. So it's very cool to see this come to fruition. And I think there's a lot of really cool possibilities for it. So surprise, surprise, I'm excited to play it. But I'm curious what you guys think. What do you want to see from this game, and what are you excited for? What do you hope they keep? What do you hope they throw out as far as previous mechanics goes? The Total War Saga games are sort of these interesting little testing grounds where they can try new crazy stuff, so I'm excited to see what they come up with. But anywho, thanks for watching, and I'll give you more coverage as it starts to actually release. Gamescom comes up in about 2 weeks, so we might see an announcement then. But thanks for watching, and have a great day out there.